First of all, there are many, many things that Dr. Licona said that I completely agree with. The fact that I have criticized what I believe to be compromises with vitally important issues on his part does not change the fact that, interestingly enough, even though he would repeatedly say, sure, that could be wrong, sure, that could be wrong, but then he would give a meaningful argument for why it might not be an error at all. It does seem to me that there is the standard. Look, I know in the academy, you are not allowed to believe that Scripture is theopneustos as a presupposition. You're just not allowed to do that. You can't believe it's inspired. The idea of harmonization is considered to be merely a fundamentalist relic, and therefore don't even bother with it. I get it. There were a number of examples that Dr. Licona gave that I thought were very good. I don't want anyone to hear the criticisms that will inevitably have to be voiced to be a simple statement that he never said anything that was worthwhile or anything else, because that's not the case. At the same time, however, I think Bart Ehrman has him in the sense that he gets up in his rebuttal period and he says, it sounds like we agree about this. Because the thesis of the debate is, are the New Testament documents historically reliable? And it sounds like Mike Licona just said, no. Now, I recognize what Ehrman does is he says, I am using the modern standard of historically accurate. And so though I know that there's really nothing in ancient history that is historically accurate using that standard. In other words, basically, you need to have MP3 recordings minimally. Video would be good. That kind of stuff. Therefore, there can't be anything that's historically accurate from his perspective. That's why, we've identified this as a hypercritical perspective on his part. They are using different standards of reliability. Dr. Licona's position is that given what the Gospels are, that they are not meant as modern transcripts from a court trial, that they are literary works, that they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, that they are organized in such a way that obviously everybody who writes anything, whether it is a dry historical piece or a passionate appeal for faith, which is what the Gospels are, the author has to have the freedom to choose what they're going to include, how they're going to order things. When you're talking about someone's ministry, do you start at the end? Do you start at the beginning? How do you order things? Do you go topically? Do you go chronologically? There's just all sorts of things that enter into a meaningful discussion of this particular subject. And so Dr. Licona's argument in his new book is that in reality, the Gospels fit very well with Plutarch and this historical biographical category of writing, and that in the ancient context, that they are reliable for what they were intended to be. And obviously, I agree that Dr. Licona's categories are the only rational categories to apply. I think it's laughable that Bart Ehrman would apply the standards of today, which could be different, as was brought out in the debate 200 years from now, but apply the standards of today to documents that are 2,000 years of age. At the same time, that then raises the issue of truth. And you see, Ehrman doesn't want to get into He does not want to be held accountable for providing a theological basis for his theological conclusions. He makes theological conclusions as an agnostic, but he doesn't want to be challenged on theological issues, as I discovered when we did our debate in 2009 and in the run-up to that particular thing. So, with all that said, what I wanted to do, one of the things that, Bart Ehrman is a very bright man. Okay? Everybody knows that. So is Mike Licona. So is William Lane Craig, for that matter. He's a bright man. But I am deeply troubled by the way that he handles the arguments that he has produced that obviously work really well on freshman students in his classes, but shouldn't be being repeated in this context, to be perfectly honest with you. Now, I mentioned on the last program that I had been watching the video. We're not going to be using the video, just the audio. And while Dr. Licona is behind the podium, he reads his opening statement. Ehrman has no notes, and he's talking off the top of his head, and he's prowling around the stage, and he's gesticulating, and it's just vintage Ehrman all the way along. But and these debates, when you state the thesis the way that it is, the Christian is in pretty much a no-win situation. And I'm going to do this. It's going to take time. I don't know when I'm going to have time to do it. But if you want to make the argument, and Licona sort of did this in some of his statements, Ehrman's written a lot of stuff. And it's not difficult to go through that large body of literature now and pick on stuff. Sometimes validly, sometimes not. It's real easy to create the sense of contradiction between his particularly scholastic work and his more popular work. And you can even present contradiction between things he said in misquoting Jesus and in his work on how Jesus became God, because even he admits he's changed his view. So you can create contradiction in Bart Ehrman. And what I'd like to do sometime is to come up with 50 seconds, maybe 1 minute, of contradictions, allegations of contradiction in Bart Ehrman, and then say, and you only have 50 seconds to respond. Because that's what you get in these debates. It's always easier to present allegations of contradiction than it is to respond to them. It always takes at least 5 times as long as it takes you to announce an alleged contradiction to explain why it isn't, at least in a truthful fashion, in a meaningful fashion. That's why these debates are so easy for him. He can just simply throw out, the old, I responded to his John has the crucifixion on a different day than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I responded to that. That was one of the presentations I made at the Jeremiah Cry thing in New York in 2011? Like 6-7 years ago? He's still throwing it out. And Licona agrees with him. So, but how long does it take me to make a credible case against that perspective? Much longer than it takes to simply announce that it's a contradiction. Much longer. In a truthful sense. Part of this is just we live in a day of sound bites. And you just don't get any deeper in your level of knowledge if you're satisfied with sound bites. That's why I try to avoid soundbite argumentation against, like, the Quran. That's why I read a bunch of the Quran today to try to, is there a context here? Soundbite stuff. Anyway, so here I want you to listen to how Ehrman presents something here. I'm going to point out the problems and then point out that he knows the problems. This will be our introduction to debunking the Bart Ehrman methodology of attacking the Christian faith, which he says he's not doing, but facts are facts. So let's listen in here.
The gospel writers want to emphasize different things. And the problem with thinking that they're all accurate is that it means that you read one of the Gospels as if it's saying the same thing as another one of the Gospels, when in fact they might be emphasizing different things based on the different stories that they've heard.
Now, I can simply, I'm not even sure that they're up, unfortunately, but I spent 9 years teaching through the Synoptic Gospels at PRBC. And in the introductory material, which I'll probably have to redo someday, we specifically laid out the fact that Mark has a particular audience in mind. Matthew has a different audience in mind. Luke has a different audience in mind. And John is writing at a later period of time and has yet another audience in mind. And that we must give each of the gospel writers the freedom to pick and choose who they're going to speak to, how they're going to speak to them, what they're going to include, how they're going to arrange their material, how they're going to use language that is going to be the most effective in reaching their particular audience, which is why, for example, you find very Jewish style of argumentation and scripture citation in Matthew that you do not have in Luke. You do not have it in Luke. They have to have that freedom. You have to allow Mark to be Mark and Matthew to be Matthew and Luke to be Luke. And when you squish them all together, as what happened in the 2nd century in what's called the Diatessaron, when you create one gospel out of the 4, that is an artificial and misleading document. No question about it. But notice the presuppositional error in Ehrman's thought. Did you catch it? I want you to listen a second time. Let's see if you can find the presuppositional error in what Bart Ehrman says.
The gospel writers want to emphasize different things. And the problem with thinking that they're all accurate is that it means that you read one of the Gospels as if it's saying the same thing as another one of the Gospels, when in fact they might be emphasizing different things based on the different stories that they've heard.
Did you catch it? It's the use of the term accurate. What he's saying is, if you have, let's just talk about the synoptics here. Let's leave John out for the moment. If you have 3 writers who have different emphases, they have chosen to write different length versions, that they cannot be accurate in describing the same event. I read a book my junior year in high school called Incredible Victory, The Battle of Midway by Walter Lord. And it's a long story about how that ended up allowing me to get my wife, but that's a completely different story we won't get into right now. But it is sort of historical fiction in the sense that it quotes people when you wouldn't be able to quote them, but it's all based on research, and it was very accurate in its historical material and stuff like that. So it is a book about the Battle of Midway. And it moves along really well. And if you want to know about the Battle of Midway, and I'd highly recommend it to you, it's a great book. Really, really is. It's a page turner, as we used to say, or a Kindle clicker, I guess, is what you'd have today, or whatever. Now, I have another book at home. I don't have it here in my library. I have it at home, called Shattered Sword. And it's been written since then. And it really sort of is currently the standard work on the Battle of Midway. It is 4 times longer, at least, than Incredible Victory. But you know what? If all I had had was Shattered Sword, I never would have learned about the Battle of Midway, because I'm not going to read a book that big. And it ain't a page turner. It's dry, scholastic history. Does that mean the Battle of Midway didn't take place? Does that mean they're both inaccurate? No, it just means they're different. Ehrman presuppositionally assumes that if you have different authors with different purposes, writing different length books with different emphases, that they can't be accurate. Why? Why? So when you hear a news report that takes place immediately and gives you just the outline of what happens, and then you hear 2 months later, there is a half-hour program on the same thing, they can't be accurate because they're of different lengths and have different purposes. No, not at all. Just because the authors are emphasizing different things does not mean that the historical events that are part of the fabric of their story did not take place, and that we cannot determine the nature of those historical events.